The orange glow climbs above the ridgeline like a second sunrise, except this one consumes everything it touches. Embers drift through the air like hellish snow, landing on wooden roofs, catching in the dry grass, spreading their hunger across the landscape. The wind carries the smell of pine and ash across the territory of Ridgemont, Colorado, in the year of our Lord, 1884. Somewhere in this chaos, someone is going to die tonight. Somewhere in this chaos, someone is going to live. And the difference between those two outcomes rests on a decision made 3 years earlier by a man everyone in town called a fool. His name was Nathaniel Whitmore, and he had been blind since childhood. Not from birth. He'd seen sunlight once, seen his mother's face, seen the color of grass. Oh, a fever took his sight when he was 7 years old, and he'd spent the next 43 years navigating a world through his fingertips, his ears, and a memory of light that grew fainter with each passing year. By the time he arrived in Ridgemont in the spring of 1881, led by a gentle horse named Bonnet, Nathaniel Whitmore had learned to see better than most sighted men. He saw through vibrations in the earth beneath his boots. He saw through the particular quality of silence that meant danger. He saw through the tone of a man's voice, whether he was speaking truth or deception. The Reverend Nathaniel Whitmore settled on a 40-acre homestead 3 miles north of Ridgemont proper, a stretch of undulating pine forest with a small creek running through the eastern edge. The cabin had come with the land, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, built by a miner who'd abandoned it when the silver ran dry. Nathaniel made repairs by touch, learning the building's shape through his hands, understanding its weaknesses through the play of wind through its gaps. He'd brought with him a library of books, each one marked in Braille that he'd learned to read years before. He'd brought his fiddle, he'd brought his faith, and he'd brought something else, something that would matter far more than anyone in Ridgemont could have anticipated. He'd brought a keen and particular knowledge of fire. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. What part of the country calls you home? 20 years before Nathaniel arrived in Colorado, he had lived in New Hampshire, in a town called Hartwell that sat at the edge of a vast forest. His mentor was an old man named Samuel Garrett, a man who'd lost his left arm in a mill accident and had taught Nathaniel that blindness and missing limbs didn't make a man helpless. They just made him pay attention to what sighted, whole men ignored. Samuel had been the town's forest keeper, tasked with preventing fires before they could spread. Samuel taught Nathaniel to read the forest through his fingertips, to understand the fuel load beneath the trees, the dead wood, the dry brush, the accumulated tinder that waited for a spark. Samuel had shown him, through descriptions so vivid that Nathaniel could picture them perfectly, how fires moved, how they needed fuel and heat and air, a triangle of necessity, how a man could break that triangle by removing the fuel, how cleared land, properly maintained, could become a barrier that fire could not cross. Samuel had shown him maps with his fingers tracing the contours, explaining how certain paths through forests had been maintained for centuries by indigenous peoples who understood that fire was a tool, that fuel reduction prevented catastrophe. When Samuel died, Nathaniel had mourned him in a darkness that was already familiar. But he had carried that knowledge westward, carried it to Colorado, carried it as surely as a man might carry water in a bucket. In the summer of 1881, Nathaniel began to clear his land. He started with a team of 2, himself, and a young man named Jacob, who'd been hired to help with general homestead work. Jacob was strong in his arms and weak in his patience. But Nathaniel didn't need Jacob's patience. He needed his strength. They began at the western edge of the property, where the forest pressed closest. Nathaniel would move through the brush with his hands extended, feeling for deadfall, for branches low enough to catch fire and carry flames upward into the canopy. He moved with deliberation, with a kind of meditation. His fingers found the wood before his boots found the ground. He would indicate to Jacob which trees should stay, which should be cut, which dead wood should be cleared away. Jacob would fell the trees and clear the branches, moving brush to a central area where Nathaniel had arranged for periodic burns to clear the accumulated fuel. It was work that no one asked him to do. No one had suggested that fire might come to Ridgemont. The forest had always been there. The town had always been there. Nothing suggested that one day the two forces might collide in a way that would change everything. By the fall of 1881, word of Nathaniel's project had spread through Ridgemont. The town's leading merchant, a man named Archibald Sawyer, who held considerable influence as the primary supplier of goods and the de facto leader of most civic decisions, had come out to the homestead to see what the blind preacher was doing with his land. Archibald Sawyer was a man of substantial frame and substantial opinion. He wore a waistcoat even in the summer heat and spoke with the confidence of someone who had rarely been contradicted. He looked at the cleared strips of land running through Nathaniel's property, at the piles of cut wood, at the carefully maintained areas of reduced brush, and his face darkened with amusement. "What is this wasteland you're creating?" Sawyer had asked, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who already knew his own answer. "Your property looks like a scarred corpse. You've destroyed the beauty of the land, Reverend, and for what purpose? Some biblical notion of tending the garden? The forest has stood here for centuries. It will stand here for centuries more. You're wasting your labor and spoiling the landscape for the rest of us who have to look at it." The words spread. At the mercantile, men would gather and speak of the blind preacher clearing his land for no reason. At the church social, women would mention how he'd ruined a perfectly good property with his strange obsession. The word that came to dominate the conversation was wasted. This was wasted land, and this was a wasted effort. This was a man wasting his site's absence on an imaginary catastrophe that would never come. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now and let us know you're here for more tales of vindication. But Nathaniel didn't stop. He expanded the work. He hired more men, temporary labor from the town, men who were skeptical but willing to work for wages. He cut farther into his property, creating what amounted to defensive barriers of cleared land running in strategic directions, using the natural contours of his acreage to create firebreaks that would funnel flames away from the property if fire ever came from the north or west. The work consumed his days and many of his nights. His hands grew calloused. His body, already lean, became lean and weathered. And neighbors who passed on the road saw him working alone sometimes, his walking stick set aside, his hands moving across the remaining brush with a kind of determined grace. Some felt sympathy. Most felt confirmation of their existing beliefs. The man was stubborn, obsessive, locked into an imaginary caution that had no basis in reality. Archibald Sawyer would sometimes laugh about it in public settings, his voice carrying across the mercantile or the town square. "The Reverend's building his fortress against an enemy that doesn't exist," Sawyer would say. "Fire doesn't come to Ridgemont. We're too civilized, too prepared. The Reverend would do better to spend his time preaching about what actually matters. But Nathaniel continued. He worked through the winter of 1882, clearing ice and snow from his paths, maintaining the barriers he'd created. He worked through the spring, through the summer of 1883. He taught others how to do the work, showed Jacob and the other men how to identify the right trees to leave, the right brush to remove, the right way to maintain the cleared spaces so they wouldn't simply grow back. By the autumn of 1883, nearly 3 years after he'd begun, Nathaniel's firebreak project was complete. His 40 acres had been transformed, running through the property in strategic patterns that only someone who understood fire, who understood how wind moved, how flames traveled, could have designed, were cleared strips of land, some 20 feet wide, some wider, creating a network of defensible space. The remaining trees were spaced far enough apart that fire couldn't leap from canopy to canopy. The brush was cleared, the deadwood was gone. What had once looked like scarred destruction now looked like something else. Protection. Preparation. A man's answer to an enemy everyone else insisted didn't exist. Nathaniel had spent what amounted to nearly a quarter of his life savings on the project. He had invested not just money, but physical labor in a work that had brought him nothing but ridicule. He had created what might be the most carefully maintained defensible space in the territory, done entirely by a blind man whose vision of the future was clearer than the sight of any man in Ridgemont. The winter of 1883 turned mild. Snow fell but melted quickly. Spring came early, and with it came something else, an absence. And rain didn't come in April. It didn't come in May. The creeks that fed the territory began to run low. The grass in the meadows, normally verdant and thick, began to take on a golden tinge. The bark of the trees, when Nathaniel touched them during his daily walks, felt drier than he could remember. He could smell it on the wind, the particular scent of a landscape drying out, of moisture evaporating, of fuel preparing itself to burn. In his bones, in the way the air felt against his skin, in the quality of birdsong that seemed higher and more frantic, he understood what was coming. He had lived 50 years, and 30 of those years had been lived entirely in darkness, but the darkness hadn't blinded him to what the natural world was telling him. He began to increase his patrols of the firebreaks, checking them for any growth that might have returned, any new deadfall that might have accumulated. He found very little. His preparation was holding. The firebreaks remained clear, ready, waiting. By June of 1884, the land was tinder dry. Rain was a memory. The sky remained cloudless week after week, month after month. The heat pressed down on the territory with the weight of something living, something hungry. It began, as these things often do, with lightning. A storm came up from the south on the evening of July 10th, 1884. It was a brief storm. The rain it carried was negligible, not nearly enough to dampen the fuel load that had been accumulating for half a year. But the lightning was prodigious. The storm lasted perhaps 2 hours, and in that time, lightning struck 47 times in the territory surrounding Ridgemont. Only 3 of those strikes found dry forest. 3 was enough. The first fire, starting in the forest 5 miles to the southwest of Ridgemont, grew slowly at first. The wind didn't favor it immediately, but by the morning of July 11th, when scouts sent from town reached the area, the fire was already consuming acres per hour. By afternoon, it was spreading at a rate that no amount of water hauled in buckets could combat. The fire moved north and east, driven by the afternoon winds. The second fire, some 3 miles to the west of Ridgemont, had started at the same moment, but had grown faster, moving with the evening wind as if it were hunting. The third fire had burned itself out in rocky terrain where fuel was scarce. But the other two continued to grow. Word reached Ridgemont by evening of the 11th. Archibald Sawyer convened a meeting of the town council. Men would be sent to fight the fire. Supplies would be gathered. Perhaps they could stop it before it reached the town itself. There was, in those early hours, a sense that this was a problem that could be solved, that human will and determination could stand against the approaching flames. But the fire had other intentions. The wind shifted during the night of July 11th, turning northerly, pushing both fires toward Ridgemont with increasing speed. By the morning of July 12th, scouts who ventured toward the flames reported that they had merged. What had been two separate fires was now one vast conflagration, moving across the forest with an appetite that seemed infinite. If Wild West retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership to support us and get exclusive content about these frontier stories. The council convened again. Evacuation was discussed, but evacuation to where? The fire was moving north toward the higher elevations, east toward the farming lands where many of the townspeople had properties. There was nowhere obvious to go. Some argued for defending the town itself, creating firebreaks around the buildings, hoping that the concentrated nature of the settlement might allow them to prevent the flames from taking hold. But as the day progressed and more scouts returned with increasingly frantic reports, it became clear that nothing the town could accomplish in a matter of hours would be sufficient. The fire was moving faster than men could work. The heat was already palpable in Ridgemont, 10 miles away. The sky, which had been blue that morning, was beginning to take on a brownish tint. By evening, Archibald Sawyer and the other leaders of Ridgemont were facing a catastrophe. The fire would reach the town by the next afternoon, maybe sooner. There was no plan that any of them could articulate that would save the town itself. They could only hope to save lives, to move people to safety, though no one could quite identify where safety existed. It was Archibald Sawyer himself who made the journey to Nathaniel Whitmore's homestead. Sawyer came with 3 other men, riding horses hard through the afternoon of July 12th, the sky already darkening with smoke. They found Nathaniel working in his largest cleared area, his hands moving across the earth into checking the integrity of the firebreak one final time. Sawyer dismounted with less grace than usual, his waistcoat sweat-stained and dust-covered. For a moment, he stood looking at the cleared land, at the careful work of 3 years, and something in his expression changed. "Reverend," Sawyer said, and his voice had lost its usual confident tone, "we need your help." Nathaniel turned toward the sound of Sawyer's voice. "Your fire?" he asked. The word "your" carried no accusation. It was simply a fact. The fire that was coming had been beyond their control. "The fire is coming down from the northwest," Sawyer said. "It'll be here by tomorrow morning. We can't stop it. We can't evacuate. But your land, your cleared land, if what you've built is what I think it is, it might protect us. We need to shelter here. All your firebreaks, they might save our lives." There was no apology in Sawyer's request. There was only desperation. Nathaniel stood in silence for a moment, considering. Then he spoke, his voice calm, steady, the voice of a man who had been waiting for precisely this conversation. "How many people?" Nathaniel asked. "Most of the town," Sawyer admitted. "Maybe 400 people. livestock too, maybe 200 head of cattle, horses, mules. Nathaniel nodded. Then we should prepare, he said. You'll have someone bring as much water as the town can spare. You'll have people bring supplies, food, medical materials. The fire will burn itself out. It will take time. But the fire breaks should hold. They were built to hold. He paused, then added, And Archibald, you will need to listen very carefully to what I tell you about this land. You mocked it for 3 years. Now you'll need to trust it, and you'll need to trust me. That night, the townspeople of Ridgemont began to move. Families gathered what possessions they could carry. Livestock were herded toward Nathaniel's property. By dawn of July 13th, the roads leading north from Ridgemont were filled with people walking and riding, driving animals, carrying children, looking back at the horizon where the sky had turned an apocalyptic orange. The fire reached the northern edge of Ridgemont just after midday. Buildings caught fire in sequence, small fires that grew larger, that spread to neighboring structures. The heat could be felt for miles. The smoke was so thick that in the middle of the day, the sun became a dim red disk, visible only as a concept, not as actual light. But Nathaniel's land was ready. The people of Ridgemont arrived in waves, and Nathaniel directed them, his understanding of the property's layout serving him as perfectly as sight might have. He placed families in the safest areas, the largest cleared space, surrounded by the fire breaks on 3 sides. He directed livestock to the eastern end of the property, where the creek ran and where the land was most protected. He positioned men with supplies of water to defend the property from any spot fires that might establish themselves, though he explained that the fire breaks should hold. And then, as the fire approached, they waited. The fire came down from the northwest, the way a hunter stalks prey. It moved through the forest with a sound like thunder that never stopped, with heat that could be felt even from the center of Nathaniel's property. The sky turned dark as midnight, but it was not the darkness of clouds. It was the darkness of smoke so thick that it blocked the light of the sun entirely. People wept, children cried, animals grew frantic. But the fire breaks held. The wall of flame that approached from the northwest slowed as it reached the first cleared area. Fire needs fuel to travel, and the space Nathaniel had created was nearly empty of fuel. The fire tried to jump across. Flames reached toward the trees that stood beyond the first fire break, but the distance was too great. The flames lacked the fuel-driven momentum to cross the cleared space. The fire moved east, seeking the forest at the eastern edge of Nathaniel's property, but the creek ran there, and the cleared land on the eastern edge had been maintained just as carefully as the western. The fire tried to establish itself, created small pockets of flame that began to climb the trees, but men stationed there using water from the creek fought those small fires and contained them. By the afternoon of the 13th, the worst had passed. The main fire continued to burn to the south and east of Ridgemont, consuming forest and grassland. But Nathaniel's cleared fire breaks had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had broken the triangle of fire. They had removed the fuel, and without fuel, the flames had no pathway to advance further. For 3 days, the people of Ridgemont sheltered on Nathaniel Whitmore's cleared land. The fire burned all around them, to the north, to the west, to the south. The heat was constant. The smoke hung in the air like a living thing, making breathing difficult, making visibility almost non-existent beyond a few feet. But the fire breaks held. Nathaniel moved among the people, offering comfort and instruction. He showed them how to maintain the watch positions, how to use water efficiently, how to identify any spot fires before they could spread. His blindness, which had been a source of ridicule, became a source of strength. While others were blinded by the smoke and the darkness, Nathaniel navigated with the same confidence he always possessed. He understood the land through his feet and his hands. He moved with certainty. On the fourth day, the wind shifted. The fire, having consumed the fuel on 3 sides, began to move away from Ridgemont, drawn eastward by the changing wind pattern. By the 5th day, the smoke was clearing. By the 6th day, people could see the sun again, though it was a pale, diminished sun filtered through the remaining smoke in the upper atmosphere. The firebreaks had protected not just Nathaniel's property, but more importantly, the lives of 400 people. More than that, they had protected livestock, prevented the spread of fire to the agricultural lands to the east, and, in a real sense, saved the settlement of Ridgemont itself. If the fire had reached the buildings before the townspeople had found shelter, if Nathaniel's land hadn't been ready, the death toll would have been measured in the dozens, possibly in the hundreds. On the morning of July 16th, when the danger had clearly passed and people had begun to assess the broader devastation across the territory, Archibald Sawyer came to find Nathaniel. Sawyer's face was streaked with soot. His waistcoat was torn and mud-stained. He looked like a man who had encountered something that had fundamentally changed his understanding of how the world worked. "Reverend," Sawyer said, and he knelt. Actually knelt, his knee touching the ground. "I mocked you," Sawyer continued. "I called your work wasteland. I spoke against you in town, and you have saved my life. You have saved the lives of everyone in this territory. I was wrong. I was profoundly, fundamentally wrong." Nathaniel reached down and took Sawyer's hand, pulling him to his feet. "You were ignorant," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle. "There's a difference. Ignorance can be cured by knowledge. You know better now." The town council convened a formal meeting, and one by one, the men who had mocked Nathaniel stood and spoke acknowledgement of what he had done. Now, the women who had whispered about his wasted land brought him food and thanks. The families whose lives had been preserved on his property stood before him and offered gratitude that went beyond words. That Sunday, the church in Ridgemont was filled to capacity. Nathaniel preached, and his sermon was not about vindication or about how foolish his mockers had been. His sermon was about seeing with more than eyes, about listening to voices that speak warnings others ignore, about the power of preparing for disasters that the majority believes will never arrive. In the weeks following the fire, as the town began to assess damage and plan for rebuilding, Nathaniel established a school of sorts. He taught anyone who was interested about fire management, about fuel reduction, about creating defensible spaces. He taught about the knowledge that had come from Samuel Garrett, about the indigenous practices that had maintained forests across centuries, about the idea that fire was not an evil to be met with alarm, but a force to be understood and managed. The governor of Colorado, learning about what had occurred in Ridgemont, made a journey to meet Nathaniel. He rode out to the homestead with a delegation of men and stood looking at the fire breaks that had saved a town. "Reverend Whitmore," the governor said, "what would you ask of this territory, given what you've accomplished?" Nathaniel considered the question. "I would ask that other towns learn what we've learned," he said. "That other settlements understand that fire will come eventually. Perhaps not this year, perhaps not in the next decade, but fire will come. And preparation is not wasteland. Preparation is wisdom. If other towns along the frontier would begin their own firebreak projects, begin their own work of fuel reduction, the territory would be that much safer when fire arrives next. The governor commissioned Nathaniel to travel throughout Colorado in the following years, teaching these principles, helping communities understand what he understood. Nathaniel became, in his final decades, something he'd never anticipated: an authority, a man whose knowledge was sought, whose vision, though he himself was blind, was clearer than that of any sighted man in the territory. Thank you for watching this story about Nathaniel Whitmore and the town of Ridgemont, Colorado. These are the stories that remind us that preparation is never wasted, that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that the people we mock might just be the ones who save us. In the years following the fire of 1884, the term Whitmore's Way entered the vocabulary of settlements across Colorado and beyond. When someone spoke of creating firebreaks, of preparing defensible space, of implementing fuel reduction strategies, they sometimes called it doing it the Whitmore way. More than that, the story itself became a teaching tool. Mothers told their children about the blind preacher who could see what others couldn't. Teachers used the story to explain why preparation matters, why listening to voices that speak differently from the consensus might be worthwhile. The story became a kind of parable, a frontier teaching tale about the cost of dismissing wisdom simply because it comes from an unexpected source. Nathaniel Whitmore lived another 23 years after the fire of 1884. He continued to preach, continued to teach, continued to advocate for fire management and preparation. He died in his sleep at the age of 73, and his funeral brought people from across the territory, people whose lives had been saved by his clearing, people whose settlements had followed his teachings, people whose land had been protected because someone had listened to what a blind man had tried to tell them. The cabin where he had lived stands still today, maintained by the Historical Society of Ridgemont. The firebreaks, though no longer actively maintained, are still visible from the air. Those cleared strips of land that cut through the forest in patterns that only someone with deep knowledge of fire's nature could have designed. And when archaeologists and historians examine the landscape, they can see the architecture of Nathaniel Whitmore's vision, a 3-year-long effort to break the triangle of fire, to remove the fuel, to create a space where people could shelter when the inevitable came. The story of Nathaniel Whitmore reminds us that wisdom does not require eyesight. Vision is not the same as being able to see. A blind man can see the future more clearly than a sighted man can see the present. And sometimes, the people we mock are the only ones who can actually save us. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories about the frontier people who shaped the American West, the people who were mocked, vindicated, and remembered.